The morning air on the range was sharp, carrying the echo of boots and distant gunfire. Rows of cadets stood ready, each gripping their rifles, each waiting for orders. But among them stood one woman who wasn't holding anything. Her weapon had been taken, not for malfunction, not for security, but for judgment. The colonel's words still rang in her ears. "If you can't qualify at my standard, you don't carry my weapon." A few chuckles followed, quiet but sharp enough to cut through her composure. She didn't look away, didn't flinch. She just stood there, eyes fixed on the horizon, letting the laughter fade into the wind. They had seen her stumble in training. They'd seen her stay late at the range, missing the mark by inches. And they had already decided who she was, another hopeful trying to prove she belonged in a world that didn't want her there. The range that morning wasn't just a test of skill. It was a stage for humiliation. Her weapon, once a symbol of readiness, now sat locked behind the colonel's desk, a reminder that she was being measured differently from everyone else. But there's something strange about being stripped of what others think defines you. When you lose the thing they use to judge your worth, you start to understand what your worth actually is. As the drills began, she could feel their eyes on her, the sideways glances, the half-smiles. Yet she stayed motionless, watching each movement, each breath, each trigger pull. She wasn't competing against them anymore. She was learning them. Every rhythm, every mistake, every strength disguised as arrogance. They thought they had broken her discipline. What they didn't know was that taking her weapon only sharpened her focus. With no rifle in her hands, her body became her study. Every stance was measured, every breath intentional. The heartbeat that others ignored became her metronome. She watched the recoil of rifles, the lag between shots, the overconfidence that made even the best miss by a fraction. The humiliation had forced her into silence, but in that silence, she was building something dangerous: awareness. There's a kind of fire that doesn't show in the eyes, a kind of strength that grows only when you have nothing left to defend. That's what began to burn in her that morning. The weapon wasn't the issue, it was the symbol. They believed that without it, she'd be powerless. But she was beginning to understand that the power wasn't in the steel she carried. It was in the steadiness she refused to lose. When the colonel walked past her later that day, he barely noticed her at first. She looked calm, maybe even defeated. But she was studying him too. The way he evaluated others, how his tone changed when he spoke to his best shooters, how he carried pride like armor. He didn't realize that by taking her weapon, he'd given her a lesson no manual could teach. She learned control without force, patience without approval, and strength without recognition. For days, she moved like a shadow on the range, silent but observant. Every mistake she had ever made replayed in her mind, not to punish herself, but to decode it. Every missed target became data, every insult became fuel. She started timing reactions, predicting movements, understanding how every soldier depended too heavily on what they held instead of what they knew. She began to see the range differently, not as a test of aim, but as a test of awareness. By the end of the week, even the laughter had stopped. Some of the same cadets who mocked her started to notice that she wasn't falling behind. In drills without weapons, she was faster. In tactical maneuvers, sharper. When they hesitated, she moved. When they doubted, she decided. The absence of a weapon had turned into an advantage no one expected. She had stopped trying to prove herself and had started embodying the discipline they only pretended to understand. The colonel's test had become her transformation. What he meant as punishment had become her training ground. Without a weapon, she had no crutch to lean on, no excuses to make. What remained was pure skill, unpolished, unpraised, but undeniable. The humiliation that was supposed to break her had stripped away every layer of dependency until all that was left was focus. Every glance, every whisper, every ounce of doubt became part of the pressure she learned to master. On that cold morning, when the range echoed with the sound of others proving themselves with bullets, she was proving something else, something quieter, something they wouldn't understand until much later. She wasn't there to match their firepower. She was there to master herself. When the colonel made his decision to take away her weapon, it wasn't about a rule or a regulation. It was about perception. In his eyes, she was a variable that didn't fit the system, a risk that disrupted the rhythm of tradition. To him, it wasn't personal, it was protocol. But to her, It was a mirror reflecting the quiet bias that had existed all along. The unspoken belief that precision belonged to the strong, that strength had a certain face, a certain voice, and a certain history. The decision revealed something that had been building beneath every order, every command, every evaluation. It wasn't just that they doubted her ability. They doubted her right to even be tested the same way. The colonel's tone that day carried the kind of authority that no one questioned. His word was final, and everyone knew it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His decision came down like a verdict. Around him, the instructors nodded, some reluctantly, others with quiet satisfaction. They had seen this pattern before. When someone didn't fit the mold, the system didn't bend. It removed the piece that made it uncomfortable. The weapon confiscation wasn't about her missed shots or slow reloads. It was a statement, a reminder of hierarchy disguised as discipline. She stood in front of him as he spoke, her eyes steady but her thoughts moving faster than her pulse. She knew what it meant to lose her weapon in front of her peers. It wasn't just a training penalty, it was a mark. It said she was unreliable, unready, undeserving. The colonel believed he was teaching her accountability, but what he was really doing was showing his own limits. In trying to make her an example of failure, he exposed the quiet walls that existed within the ranks. Walls built from tradition, from pride, from fear of change. Among the cadets, reactions were mixed. Some shifted uncomfortably, others smirked. No one spoke out. The chain of command was too heavy to challenge. But beneath their silence, something unspoken pulsed, a recognition that this wasn't just about her. It was about the kind of soldier the system was designed to create and the kind it refused to see. She represented something new, something that didn't fit the old blueprint of strength. And in the colonel's decision, every layer of that old mindset was laid bare. In private conversations, whispers spread. Some said the colonel was right, that standards had to be protected. Others questioned if the standard was really about skill or just about control. It wasn't that she couldn't shoot. It was that she didn't fit their picture of who a shooter should be. The weapon, in this story, became more than metal and mechanics. It became a symbol of belonging. To hold it was to be accepted. To lose it was to be exiled. That was the real lesson hiding behind the colonel's authority. When she returned to her quarters that evening, the range noise still echoed in her mind. The colonel's voice replayed in fragments, the clipped tone of command cutting through her thoughts. She wasn't angry. She was observant. She started to realize that every decision from the top carried an echo of belief. Belief in what kind of soldier was worth trusting. And that belief, she saw now, wasn't built entirely on merit. It was built on history, repetition, and the illusion of order. The colonel wasn't trying to crush her spirit. He was protecting his version of balance. But in doing so, he revealed the imbalance at the core of it all. Every instructor, every cadet who watched that day learned something different. The colonel thought he was maintaining discipline. The others saw how quickly fairness could become convenience. Some would carry that lesson quietly, others would bury it. But for her, the realization became a kind of clarity. The system didn't need her to fail. It needed her to stop trying to succeed on her own terms. That was the real threat. Her presence wasn't just a test of skill, it was a challenge to comfort. The colonel continued his duties as if nothing had happened. In his reports, he wrote about maintaining standards, ensuring readiness, enforcing discipline. But the paper couldn't show the silence that followed after she left the range. It couldn't show the eyes that turned away or the respect that subtly shifted. The men who had laughed before now spoke less. The confidence that once filled the air had started to thin. Because somewhere in that decision, the colonel had planted doubt, not in her, but in the system itself. Behind every order, there's a belief. And that belief can either shape fairness or reveal prejudice. What the colonel didn't realize was that by taking her weapon, he had unintentionally exposed the unspoken rule that had guided countless decisions before her, that authority didn't always equal understanding. She wasn't the first to face it, and she wouldn't be the last. But she was the first to see it clearly, not as punishment, but as proof of what she was up against. When the range drills resumed the next morning, the others came armed with polished weapons and renewed confidence. She came with nothing but her breath and focus. The absence of a rifle didn't make her invisible. It made her aware in a way none of them could understand. While they checked their magazines and adjusted their sights, she closed her eyes for a moment and listened, to the cadence of boots on gravel, the rhythm of breathing before a shot, the faint mechanical click of safeties disengaging. What they saw as silence, she treated as information. What they dismissed as stillness, she turned into control. Every move on the range became a study in precision. She began to understand that the power of a soldier didn't start with the weapon, it started with awareness. The weapon was only an extension of the body, but the body itself, when disciplined, was the most accurate tool of all. She learned to synchronize her breathing with her thoughts, steadying her pulse until every beat matched the rhythm of calm. Her instructors used to say, "Control your weapon." She now understood the deeper truth behind it. Control yourself, and the weapon will follow. While others fired round after round to prove their skill, she trained her focus on something quieter. She watched the subtle tremor in a cadet's hand before he squeezed the trigger. She observed the flinch that came when someone anticipated recoil. Each mistake became a lesson that didn't require bullets. She began to see patterns, how overconfidence created gaps, how anxiety disrupted aim. In her stillness, she found clarity. The others trained their reflexes, she trained her mind. She started practicing movement drills without a weapon, tracing invisible arcs through the air with her hands, mimicking the weight of steel that was no longer hers. To onlookers, it might have looked foolish, a soldier shadowboxing with ghosts, but she was perfecting the mechanics of discipline. Every step, every shift of balance, every silent motion became part of a ritual of precision. Without the distraction of recoil or sound, she could feel every detail, the tension in her muscles, the alignment of her spine, the timing of each inhale before the moment of action. Her calm became so steady that even the range officers began to notice. There was something unnerving about her composure, as if the loss of her weapon had made her more dangerous, not less. The colonel watched her one afternoon from a distance, expecting to see frustration or defeat, but saw something else entirely. Her movements were measured, exact, deliberate. She wasn't just regaining control, she was redefining it. Every motion carried intention. Every pause was filled with purpose. The others couldn't understand how someone could look so certain without holding a rifle. Some whispered that she was trying to prove a point, that she was pretending not to care. But her detachment wasn't defiance, it was discipline. She had learned that control wasn't about suppressing emotion, it was about mastering it. When humiliation came, she didn't fight it. She observed it. When doubt crept in, she didn't resist it. She examined it. Through that process, she learned to separate reaction from response. It was during one of the tactical movement exercises that her transformation became undeniable. The squad was tasked with moving through a mock combat scenario, clearing zones under simulated fire. She was assigned to observe, unarmed, while others took lead positions. When the alarms sounded, chaos unfolded quickly. Commands shouted, boots scraping, targets appearing and vanishing. But while others scrambled to adjust, she moved through the field with precision and rhythm, navigating cover points, anticipating threats before they appeared. Her timing was exact, her positioning flawless. Even without firing a single shot, she completed the drill faster than anyone else. Later, one of her peers asked how she did it. She didn't give a speech or a theory. She simply said she stopped fighting the noise. She had learned to let the chaos exist without letting it enter her. The others carried their stress like extra weight. She carried none. Her calm wasn't just a reaction. It had become her strategy. In every movement, she carried a quiet reminder. Control begins before the trigger is pulled. The instructors began to test her differently. They put her in unpredictable situations, timed her under pressure, forced her to lead without command authority. Each time, she responded with the same focused precision. What had once been seen as her weakness, her quiet nature, her restraint, was now her advantage. She had found strength in composure. While others relied on adrenaline to perform, she relied on presence. It was no longer about proving her worth to the colonel or to the others. The training ground had turned into a mirror, reflecting the truth she had always carried. A soldier's real weapon is not the tool in their hand, but the mind that guides it. She had turned control into art, calm into armor, and precision into defiance. And in doing so, she discovered that the silence between each heartbeat held more power than any bullet ever could. It began as a normal drill, the kind designed to test reflex, speed, and composure under stress. 4 commandos were selected for the exercise, each known for their precision and teamwork. The colonel called it a demonstration of standard procedure. To everyone else, it looked like another reminder that she didn't belong among them. She stood at the edge of the range, unarmed as usual, the same calm expression masking the storm of calculation behind her eyes. The sun glared off the steel targets. Dust hung in the air. The commandos stood ready, confident, unaware that the next 79 seconds would rewrite the definition of control. When the signal horn sounded, the field came alive with movement. The commandos split in pairs, sweeping the area in a practiced rhythm. They had every advantage: weapons, numbers, preparation. She had none. But what she did have was a mind trained in silence, a body tuned to reaction, and an understanding of timing so refined that hesitation no longer existed in her vocabulary. She didn't charge forward. She waited, reading them the way one reads a pattern in the wind. Every footstep, every adjustment of stance, every turn of their shoulders told her where the next movement would be. The first opportunity came when one of the commandos moved too quickly, assuming she would retreat. Instead, she pivoted sideways, using his momentum against him, striking with precision at the point where speed became imbalance. He fell before realizing what had happened. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary aggression, just execution. She picked up his rifle in a single, fluid motion, her breathing steady as if she were continuing a drill. The spectators barely had time to process the shift before she had already advanced toward cover. The colonel, watching from the control platform, leaned forward. The moment he had turned into a test was transforming into something else entirely. The second commando flanked left, circling behind her. But she had already anticipated the maneuver. Every muscle in her body reacted before thought could interfere. A swift redirection, a precise elbow, a single strike that used leverage instead of strength. The weapon dropped again. She didn't hesitate. The 30 seconds that had passed felt like a full minute to those watching, the silence between each movement louder than the shots that hadn't yet been fired. The third and fourth commandos hesitated, regrouping behind a barrier. They were trained to adapt, to outthink, to overwhelm. But she wasn't playing their game anymore. Her eyes were steady, her pulse unreadable. The colonel's test had turned into her demonstration. She advanced methodically, using terrain the way others used armor. A shift of dust behind her foot, a flash of shadow on a wall. Every environmental detail became part of her weaponry. She was no longer reacting. She was predicting. At the 45-second mark, she closed the distance between them. One tried to suppress her advance with a burst of fire, but she used the momentary distraction of the recoil to roll beneath his line of sight. A sharp, calculated movement disarmed him in 2 beats. The last commando, realizing too late what had unfolded, turned to fire but found himself already cornered. She didn't attack with rage. Every movement carried the same calm as her breathing drills, every strike measured, every decision precise. When the dust finally settled, all 4 commandos were on the ground, uninjured but disarmed, looking up at the woman they had underestimated. The stopwatch in the colonel's hand stopped at 79 seconds. No one spoke. The range, usually filled with noise and chatter after every drill, was completely silent. It wasn't just that she had completed the impossible, it was how she had done it. No shouting, no visible strain, no panic. She had moved like someone who had already seen the outcome before it happened. The cadets watching understood that what they had witnessed wasn't luck or chance. It was preparation meeting clarity. The colonel stepped forward, his expression unreadable. What he had intended as a lesson in humility had turned into something far greater. In 79 seconds, she had dismantled not only the scenario but the assumptions that had built it. Every motion had been precise, every decision rooted in training that had evolved beyond rules and repetition. She had learned to use stillness as a weapon, awareness as armor. Where others sought dominance through aggression, she had mastered balance through calm. The 4 commandos stood, shaking their heads in disbelief, still trying to understand how they had been defeated without a single unnecessary movement. She said nothing. Her silence carried more weight than any explanation could. The colonel's eyes lingered on her for a long moment, caught between pride and discomfort. He knew what he had seen, and he knew what it meant. The hierarchy he had built on assumptions had cracked. The unarmed cadet he had once considered unfit had just rewritten the standard of performance. What happened on that range became more than a drill, it became a shift. 79 seconds of controlled precision had revealed the flaw in the system's thinking. It wasn't power that won the moment, it was mastery. It wasn't force that turned the tide, it was focus. And while the others would speak of the technique, the colonel understood something deeper. The test he had designed had turned into a lesson he would never forget. The colonel had watched her performance with the kind of silence that only comes from disbelief. For years, he had built his authority on the idea that discipline flowed from command and that respect was earned through hierarchy and power. But in 79 seconds, he saw those beliefs dismantled without defiance or disobedience. She hadn't challenged him with words or rebellion. She had done it with calm precision. The kind of calm that no rank could teach and no manual could define. It wasn't her victory that unsettled him. It was what her composure revealed about his own understanding of strength. He replayed the scene in his mind long after the dust settled. The way she moved without hesitation, the absence of aggression, the control in every step. He had seen countless soldiers over his career, fighters who were fast, accurate, efficient, but none had ever demonstrated power without needing to display it. For years, he had believed that authority came from the weapon, from the rank, from the command. Watching her, he realized it came from presence. She didn't dominate the field, she harmonized with it. Every move she made was deliberate, every pause intentional. She didn't react to the situation, she defined it. That night, as he sat in his office reviewing the performance logs, he noticed something small but significant. Her accuracy, though unmeasured by bullets, had been absolute. The timestamps of her movements were flawless. Every reaction aligned perfectly with tactical intervals. Every motion registered in sync with battlefield timing. It wasn't luck or instinct. It was discipline elevated into instinct. And for the first time, the colonel understood that the training system he had built had been missing something vital. They had been teaching control through command, not through awareness. They had been drilling obedience, not understanding. In the following days, he found himself observing her differently. He expected arrogance, pride, maybe quiet satisfaction. But she carried none of it. She walked the same halls, trained at the same hours, followed the same orders. Her victory hadn't changed her pace, it had deepened it. The colonel began to see that her power came not from resistance, but from acceptance. She hadn't fought the system, she had outgrown it. Every obstacle they placed before her had become another opportunity for mastery. He started noticing how the others behaved around her. The same cadets who once mocked her now spoke to her with an unfamiliar respect. It wasn't the kind that came from fear or admiration. It was recognition. They began to mimic her stillness during drills, slow their breathing before engaging targets, measure their steps instead of rushing through them. Without speaking a word, she had shifted the rhythm of the entire unit. Even the instructors adjusted their tone, sensing that something in the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't about hierarchy anymore. It was about discipline redefined. One afternoon, the colonel called her into his office. She stood at attention, eyes calm, posture unshaken. He studied her for a long time before speaking. His questions weren't about tactics or technique. They were about perception. He wanted to understand how she had stayed centered under pressure, how she had managed to move faster without appearing rushed, how she had kept control when stripped of authority. Her answers were simple, almost disarming in their honesty. She spoke of awareness, of breath, of clarity, of trusting stillness over fear. She told him that a weapon doesn't create control, it only amplifies it. Control begins long before the moment you act. For the first time, the colonel found himself without rebuttal. Her explanation didn't challenge his experience, it expanded it. He began to realize how much of leadership was built on the illusion of control rather than the mastery of it. He had always believed that respect had to be enforced, but she had shown that respect could be earned in silence. She had done what his years of command couldn't. She had made others want to follow, not because of orders, but because of clarity. In the days that followed, he began adjusting his own methods. During drills, he emphasized patience over speed, focus over intensity. He stopped shouting commands and started teaching observation. The change was subtle at first, but it spread quickly. The cadets began to listen differently. They paid attention not just to targets, but to timing. They stopped competing against each other and started learning from each other. What had started as a moment of humiliation for one cadet had turned into a transformation for an entire unit. The colonel understood something then that he had never seen so clearly before, that leadership isn't about dominance, it's about recognition. Strength isn't loud, it's deliberate. Power doesn't demand, it radiates. And as he watched her train quietly the next morning, her movements as precise as ever, he realized that she hadn't defied his authority at all. She had reminded him what it was supposed to mean. In the weeks after the 79-second drill, the story spread through the base like a quiet current. No official reports mentioned it in detail, yet everyone knew what had happened. New recruits heard fragments of it whispered in the mess hall, officers referenced it in debriefs, and even seasoned veterans found themselves revisiting what they thought they understood about discipline and respect. What had begun as a small act of defiance, or so it seemed, had turned into a lesson that reshaped the foundation of training itself. The colonel didn't issue an announcement, but his silence spoke volumes. Policies began to change. Drills were redesigned. Evaluations started focusing on composure as much as accuracy. Her act had done what countless speeches and reforms had failed to do. It had made the system look inward. The first sign of transformation appeared in the way the instructors conducted range exercises. Where they once pushed for speed and aggression, they now began teaching rhythm and pacing. The idea was no longer to dominate the field, but to understand it. They started encouraging soldiers to find silence between action and reaction, to think before moving, to breathe before deciding. Her example became a reference point, not because of the fight itself, but because of the precision it revealed. Without meaning to, she had proven that calm wasn't weakness, it was mastery under pressure. The colonel himself began to shift his leadership style. He observed more and commanded less. During drills, he watched how cadets handled frustration, how they responded when stripped of advantage. He realized that the greatest test of strength wasn't how quickly a soldier could pull the trigger, but how effectively they could think when stripped of control. He started emphasizing mental steadiness over muscle reflex, patience over pride. Slowly, the base culture began to evolve. The atmosphere grew quieter, but it carried a sharper edge of purpose. The soldiers who once dismissed her began to study her methods. They noticed how she timed her movements, how she listened before acting, how she could read a situation before it unfolded. What was once considered her weakness became a model for efficiency. Training manuals were adjusted to include cognitive control under stress, a concept born out of her performance. Exercises were restructured to test soldiers, not just physically, but mentally. Where before there was noise and competition, now there was focus. Where there was rivalry, there was respect. She never claimed any credit for the changes. When younger cadets approached her for advice, she didn't lecture them. She simply told them to observe, to pay attention to what others ignored. She taught them that stillness was not absence, but awareness, that the strongest decisions are made in quiet moments of understanding rather than in bursts of adrenaline. Her lessons spread through word of mouth, not command. The kind of influence she carried couldn't be ordered, it could only be earned. The colonel began inviting her to observe leadership briefings, something no cadet before her had ever done. He wanted her perspective, not as a subordinate, but as a mind that saw what others didn't. She spoke little, but when she did, her insights carried precision. She pointed out flaws in field simulations, predicted errors in movement patterns, and offered small corrections that made noticeable differences in outcome. Her clarity was unsettling to some, inspiring to others. The colonel saw in her a living reminder that authority without awareness was incomplete. Her presence began to influence those beyond her immediate circle. Visiting officers from other units came to observe her drills. Reports quietly mentioned her ability to maintain composure under conditions designed to break focus. She became a silent standard, proof that training wasn't about producing obedience, but understanding. Her calmness wasn't celebrated with medals or speeches. It was recognized in the subtle way soldiers began carrying themselves differently. They spoke less, moved cleaner, thought faster. The base no longer felt like a proving ground. It felt like a place of refinement. Months later, during an advanced training review, the colonel addressed his officers and referenced her indirectly. He spoke about the need to move beyond traditional metrics of success, about valuing awareness as much as aggression. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew who he meant. The phrase, the 79-second lesson, became shorthand among the ranks, a reminder that power is never about possession and control is never about command. It was about clarity, balance, and trust in one's own discipline. The story eventually traveled beyond the base, carried by those who had witnessed it. It wasn't retold as a tale of rebellion, but as one of transformation. Her act had become a quiet doctrine, an unspoken code that shifted how soldiers trained, how leaders led, and how respect was earned. Across every field exercise that followed, instructors began emphasizing not just the art of aiming, but the art of awareness. Every cadet learned that to master the weapon, one must first master the mind. What she had done on that range was no longer just an incident. It had become a message, a moment that proved that strength doesn't demand recognition, and that true command begins the moment a leader learns to listen.